It's early in the afternoon. Welcome into this edition of Unidentified History. Uh, I, of course, am your host, Dave Unger, coming at you here today. Not sure if anybody else will be joining up today. Probably not. But that doesn't mean I can't hang out with you guys today. Hope everybody's doing well. Wanted to get an episode of Unidentified History out there. We did so much coverage of WrestleMania last weekend with um, TriCasts and post shows and things going on over on the Chair Shot. They've got their new channel and everything going on over there. It was a really great weekend for pro wrestling. I mean, I say great. Most of it was great. There's certainly some problems with WrestleMania 42, but that's not what we're here to talk about here today. We're here to talk about unidentified history and this episode that I wanted to do. And if you looked at the description for the episode, this is going to kind of be a potluck hodgepodge sort of episode that we're doing here of unidentified history today. I was just watching Weaponized was doing something from the Space Symposium, I think is what it was. They had some really good people there. David Grush actually gave a interview, which is rare. So that was kind of cool to have Grush actually on Weaponized. So I'd urge everybody to tune in there. What I'm doing here on this episode is there's been a couple of documentaries that I reviewed that I wanted to talk to you guys about and kind of give my own recap of that. One of them, of course, is S4, which is the recent Bob Lazar story, which Luigi Ventitelli was the director for that. The other thing I watched was it's at the end of 2025, we had a documentary on a Bigfoot called American Sasquatch, which was very well received, and it is a very different sort of documentary. So I'm going to recap that as well. Got a trailer that I'm going to play. Speaking of Jeremy Corbell, it looks like I don't think it's a biopic or anything like that, but it does look like something covering Jeremy's, I don't think it's his life story, but how he got involved in the whole UAP issue and industry and that sort of thing. So we'll take a look at that. I think that's coming out on May 12th. I'm going to talk about of course, the big story going on, the missing scientists and the missing or dead scientists, we should say. Some of them are legit missing, others are legit dead, and that got a lot of traction and interest this week with the death of one of the more recognizable people in the UAP field. We'll talk about that. Uh, we're gonna also at the end of the show pay tribute to Nick Pope, and I got a really good video that Ryan Sprague from Somewhere in the Skies put together right after Nick had passed away, which does more justice to anything than I could say about Nick, especially for the people who really knew him. Also going to talk about, this is more bandwagon nerds kind of related, that show that we do, the pop culture show over on the Chairshot, thechairshot.com and the Chairshot's YouTube channel. But we've been covering season 4 of Invincible. And at the end of this season, the season finale, there's a moment that takes place that got a lot of people in the UAP community talking. And I thought when I saw it, I was like, I was the only one who really thought of this. Turns out I was not. A lot of people had the same thoughts that I did. We will talk about that as we go along. But let's get into it and talk about, let's start off talking about S4. And for those of you who, most people tuning in, if anybody's tuning in, is going to know about the S4 documentary, the Bob Lazar story. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, I'm going to go ahead and play for you the trailer that we got for the S4 documentary, just as some background and context. I'm going to play that for you, and it should be able to kind of, in case you're not familiar with it, this will help a little bit. So let's go and take a look at this. And here we go.
Physical evidence now exists which proves that there is life elsewhere, and at least one form of that life has been here. As of 1989, that evidence was in the custody of the United States government. Between December of 1988 and April of 1989, I worked as a senior staff physicist in what has to be the most secret project in history. My job in this program was to be part of a back engineering team. This particular disk appeared to be in excellent condition, and because of its sleek appearance, I nicknamed it the sport model. The goal in this program was to see if the technology of the disk could be duplicated with Earth materials. To start up the reactor, of course, we need some element 115. In fact, you need 223 grams, machined into a wedge like this. The program out at S4 consisted of 3 projects: Project Galileo, Project Sidekick, and Project Looking Glass.
The file on top was Project Galileo, and as it turned out, that's the project that I was part of. And that clearly referred to reverse engineering a recovered alien spacecraft.
Just cannot be a secret from anyone, not just the American people, but the rest of the world.
All this stuff is something that happened to him. It's not who he is.
They're doing everything they can to keep this information secret.
That's empirical evidence. I saw a craft to do that, thanks to him.
Now this story spills, and the world changed.
Okay, so there we go. Stop sharing. So the movie S4, got a chance to see it. It's been out for a few weeks now. Very, very good movie. Bob's story is, of course, very polarizing, and there's a lot of people who believe him. There's a lot of people who don't believe him. The aspects of the movie that really kind of stuck out to me are, I mean, and kind of like just looking through the notes that I've got on here, we get to see a lot about the facility S4, which is hidden at Papoose Lake, south of Groom Lake, out in Area 51. They've got it. It's like 9 hangars hidden in the side of a mountain, or I say mountain, but it looked more like a hill, that sort of thing. It's built into a mountainside, but like I said, it's kind of a hillside. They've disguised it with sand and vegetation to actively camouflage it into the desert. There's a scene in there where somebody took a photograph of something out there, and Luigi is explaining it to Bob, and he kind of highlights where he thinks the hangar doors are. And to be real honest with you guys, I didn't see it that clearly. I mean, maybe if you kind of strain a little bit, you can make it out, that sort of thing. That's not to cast any doubt on it, but I wasn't seeing it as explicitly as Bob or Luigi was. But he talks a lot, of course, about the sports model, which is the one UFO that was out there that's very sleek. It's stainless steel. It was in pristine condition. He calls this thing the sports model. There's a lot, of course, about this, from a scientific standpoint, element 115, gravity propulsion, element 15, which I think is now known as moscovium. And I think like George Knapp, of course, is in this documentary, and he talks about how element 15 has now been created, but it's like very unstable, almost wispy, almost gas-like sort of thing. But there's a lot in here about element 115. There's a lot about how the craft's, how the propulsion system works, which I'll get into that in a minute. Bob's story, like I said, a lot of people believe it. A lot of people don't. Some of the stuff that they kind of get pointed out in this to support Bob's story is, of course, the 1982 phone book from Los Alamos National Lab that actually lists Robert Lazar, along with his internal phone extension. Of course, as we know, the government has repeatedly claimed that Bob Lazar never worked for Los Alamos. Well, he's in the phone book. There's a W-2 form, and sorry, my dogs are a little bit upset. You need to stop that right now. There's a tax form that shows the employer as the Department of Naval Intelligence, which of course Lazar says that proves that he has high-level clearance. You need to stop this. Hold on a second. I'll let these guys out. That'll solve that problem. They can bark downstairs. Anyway, as I was saying, my apologies about that, guys. My friend PC Tutty, thanks, brother. I'm trying to keep the dogs under control here, but they're not cooperating. Anyway, another aspect of this, they showed the W-2 form that they had, and the tax form shows the employer is the Department of Naval Intelligence. So Bob, of course, says that proves he had high-level clearance. And then you got the hand scanner aspect of things, which was something that they'd shown. He talked about this, and I forget, it's one of the documentaries that I saw where Bob explains how the hand scanner was something that was, he had never seen before, but then it like resurfaced many years later, and it mimicked this kind of device that he showed in the video. And I think, Luigi did a lot of really good work with, I don't think it was completely AI. There's some CGI in there for sure, but he did a really good job with artificial version of Bob Lazar, that sort of thing, and having him in a way where there was some de-aging and that sort of thing going on. But the hand scanner was a part of that thing. Why do people fight this thing? Why is there still all this skepticism? Yeah, the dogs were sent to silence me. Exactly. You're right, Tony. They really were. They're trying to keep me out of trouble. But anyway, they create more trouble than they help a lot of the time. But anyway, so people, of course, some of the big issues that people have with Bob Lazar, the education gap. The skeptics pointing out there's no records of him attending MIT or Caltech, even though Bob has said that. George Knapp has talked about this as well. Some people believe that, Bob's just a brilliant storyteller. He knew just enough about jet engines and physics to craft this perfect story. Yeah, maybe, but boy, he gets into the weeds on some of this stuff. And the problem with that, though, is that until recently, Bob has not really profited from this. This is not typically how grifters work. And Bob's life was pretty much ruined by this whole thing. His wife was having an affair that got outed. He was, has moved several times. He talks about moments where somebody shot out the back tire of his car at one point in time as he's trying to get on the highway, and he was just waiting to get shot in the back of the head. It didn't happen. His life was threatened. There were all sorts of things that happened to him, and it doesn't really. And I say until recently, Bob has not been one of these guys who's come out here and done a lot of interviews. I mean, he was on Joe Rogan with Jeremy Corbell, and then kind of just went silent. He did the Bob Lazar, the first documentary that Jeremy did a little while ago, and talked about things there, but he really was reclusive and was very reluctant to speak about this. If there's a reason to have some issues with his story now, it may be because he is showing up on select podcasts. I saw him. He did, of course, make that surprise appearance at Ramsey's and Jesse Michaels. It's Probably Nothing. That whole event that was going on, and I think there was the one in Austin, Texas, where they first came out there and kind of where they had Chris Ramsey was there with Jesse Michaels. This was in Austin, Texas, and that's kind of where that whole thing came from. And he made that surprise appearance with Luigi. And then he appeared on another edition of Joe Rogan, which I heard Ty Roberts from Total Disclosure Podcast was saying that Bob imbibed a little bit too much during that episode, which may be the case. But I know he's been on Area 52 with Chris Ramsey since then. I think he's probably making some other appearances. So he's getting out there a little bit more, but he's certainly not going to come on a show like mine or anything like, or some of the smaller podcasts. He's being very selective as far as the shows he wants to do. But I want to get back to the documentary, because the big thing that I took away from this, the most fascinating aspect of this, is the elements of this talking about um, the emitters, the gravity. So this documentary really gets into stuff that I had not heard before. Maybe he said it in other places before, but it wasn't put together quite like this. These craft are operated, at least the sports model, by a three-part system: the reactor, the waveguide, and gravity emitters. And it kind of is, and I've had AI kind of like look at it for me and kind of like analyze this with me, and think of it as like it's like a sound system, right? So the reactor is kind of like the amplifier. The waveguide is the speaker, and the speaker cable, and the emitters are the speakers themselves. So the way this thing works, and you've got the reactor, which is the heart. It's a small device. It's about like the size of a soccer ball or basketball. This is located in the center of the craft. It uses this triangular piece of element 115. And you saw in the trailer, Bob said you need 223 grams of that machined into a wedge shape, right? When the 115 is bombarded with protons, it then transmutes into element 116, which I'm pretty sure there's no, although we may have gotten an aspect of element 115 to a certain extent, element 116, no. Element 116, even with the whatever the craft is using, is unstable. It immediately decays. This then releases antimatter. The antimatter then gets funneled into a tube where it reacts with a gas. This creates a 100% efficient matter-antimatter reaction. This generates a ridiculous amount of heat converted into electricity by a thermoelectric generator. So it's like, okay. Now that's kind of stuff that I hadn't heard too much before. And, I'm no physics expert, but when you start thinking about it, you're like, well, yeah, chemical reaction, that might make some sense. The waveguide, it's a vertical pipe that runs up from the reactor through the center of the craft. And this is what funnels this gravity A wave. This is, I think, when the 116 decays, this is where it gets kind of like, heat rises and most things rise. So this goes into the top of the ship. Then you've got these gravity emitters. This is what actually moves the ship. There are three these large bell-shaped gravity emitters that hanging at the bottom of the craft. You can move the emitters 360 degrees. They take the gravity away from the reactor. They focus it like lens focuses flight. This is the interesting part. It bends space instead of, pushing like they talked about it in the video. Most things are being propelled from the back. There's something coming out of the back which pushes it forward, like a rocket. The emitters, instead, they focus the gravity beam in front of the craft. So the beam literally warps or folds space-time towards the ship. And the ship then falls into the destination. And we've heard this before, that it's like we open this thing up, the ship just kind of slides in, and this is how these craft can go and at ridiculous speeds. And he talks a lot about, there's aspects of things that he's talking about. It's not like a continuous flight path. They're like jumps. They're jumping through space-time. So it's almost like the jump point, like, and I don't know if it's like Guardians of the Galaxy, if you've seen that, where they go and they jump between, waypoints and that sort of thing. But it kind of sounded a little bit like that when he was looking at how they were getting across the galaxy and things like that. He talks about the two modes of flight: the Omicron mode, which is used for hovering or low speed travel. And for this, only one emitter is used to counteract Earth's gravity. The other two are used for steering. This is when the craft is most stable and visible. Then you've got the Delta mode, and this is the high-speed interstellar travel where all three emitters are pointed at a single point in space. This creates this massive spatial fold, and this allows the craft to cross vast distances almost instantly. This is when it becomes invisible or looks like a blur because light is being bent around it. Now, whether or not that has anything to do with, like, the warp bubble that we heard about in Age of Disclosure, the stuff that Lou Elizondo had talked about in Age of Disclosure, or that's in his book Imminent, I don't know. But it does explain a lot, and it's some stuff we've heard before about them slipping into this time space things. Other aspects, because I don't want to linger on the documentary for too long, but other aspects that stood out to me is that Bob only had access to two levels of the sports model, right? So he could look like they had the honeycomb. There's like this honeycomb panel that went back, and Bob could like get his head down in there and look around, and he could see the emitters that were hanging down there. And then, of course, they had the one level which had the reactor and these chairs that were like, I mean, in the video, they look like molded plastic, but they're probably some sort of metallic sort of thing that were molded. And they're very small, too small for a human. And this is one of the things that Bob had said, that he thought that there's no way that they could that they could uh, that they couldn't get into, like a human being couldn't get into these chairs because they're too small, that sort of thing. And it raised the question, and he said he saw some stuff where people were like using dummies or models of aliens or whatever to kind of see how they would fit in this chair. But the other aspect is the upper level of the sports model. Bob Lazar never had access to that. That was top secret. He was told, I think, that there were avionics or something like that up there. But this is one of the things where people who support Bob say, hey, if he was making all this shit up, if he was making the story up, then why did he limit himself to 2 levels of the UFO? Why didn't he just say, yeah, here's what's going on? It's like Star Trek up there, because there are aspects of what they're seeing with the reactor and the chair sitting around it that look like a miniaturized version of Star Trek. There's nothing grandiose like the Enterprise or anything like that, where, you have the Kong, anything like that. So a lot of people say, well, why didn't he just, make up something for the top level? Why did he limit himself to that? It's a good point. And it kind of adds some credibility to Bob's story. Some of the other stuff that was fascinating about it is, like, he was talking about when he first decided to kind of go public with this, or at least to get the public involved, he took his friends out to Area 51 and they watched one of these craft fly around and do some maneuvers and things like that. Then they went back out there and they got busted, and then they went out there like the second or third time, they got popped because Wackenhut security was out there. And Bob took off running into the desert, and everybody kind of like got away from this whole thing. And then they picked Bob up somewhere later on in the desert. Well, unfortunately for them, the sheriff was also there. And they said, well, there's an extra person in your car, and the gig was up. And that's how people found out what was going on. And Bob made the decision, of course, to talk to George Knapp. John Lear was heavily involved with that. George Knapp was involved with that. But, overall, the stuff about the, one of these guys is trying to get in now. All of a sudden, see how that works, guys? Go on. Yeah, you can come in and sit down, but you better shut up. Anyway, live podcasting, it's brilliant. But anyway, like, I think, and looking through the notes as far as anything else that was going on in the movie, that was the big highlights. Let's see, what am I missing here? The main highlights. Okay, key points. We got S4, the reverse engineering. He was hired to reverse engineer the propulsion systems of these craft. They got to that some point, and there's a lot of ties in to, like, we just talked about Kenneth Arnold in the summer of 1947. And the documentary does kind of suggest that the craft that Bob was working on were not modern inventions, but they're part of a long-term government recovery program. And that maybe in the 1947, that summer of 1947 is when we first started acquiring this technology. Now, one of the books that I'm reading right now is Magic Eyes Only. I think it's Ryan Wood is writing it, and Ryan's talking about it. And I don't know if Tony's still watching this or not, but we had covered, like, the very first episode of Unidentified History talked about the Battle of Los Angeles. And in this book, Ryan is talking about that, I think we mentioned it in the episode, that there may have been a crash somewhere in the mountains, like in the ocean, and then maybe the San Gabriel Mountains or something like that. And if that's the case, then the government may have had this stuff 5 years before anything happened at Roswell, or before anything may or may not have happened at Trinity and all that sort of stuff. So those are kind of the highlights, and I don't want to give it away. I would urge anybody to watch it, because Luigi put a lot of work into this documentary, and it's really well done. The production value is fantastic. The stuff Luigi did with AI and or CGI is done really, really well. And it really adds an element to Bob's story that you may not have heard before, or you may have heard it before and they just kind of have expanded upon it in a different way. I highly recommend it. You know, if people are going to ask me, do I believe Bob Lazar's story? Most of it, yeah. I mean, there are aspects of his story that don't add up, that sort of thing. But it's such a wild story to hear him talk about, and the things that he comes up with that you're like, man, that is one hell of an imagination if that stuff didn't happen. Is it all true? Probably not. Did he embellish aspects of it? Maybe. But I think for the most part, I think for the most part, you got to look at that and say, it's a story that has been consistently told since 1989. And, George Knapp believes him, and I have a lot of respect for George. So if George thinks it's true, it might be true. But I think, the best thing to do is watch it yourself. Make up your own mind. Decide for yourself, is he telling the truth? What aspects of this do I have problems with? I think the aspect of things that, they do get the conundrum in there that I've talked about before, that once he kind of came public with this stuff, if he was arrested, then you're in this conundrum where you're verifying his stuff is true. You're verifying his account of events is accurate. And that's a problem. Whereas the other thing you do is just completely discredit him. And, there was one aspect where near the end of the documentary where Bob talks about how he went to meet Dennis, and Dennis was his supervisor out at Area 51. And not so ironically, Dennis was the pseudonym that Bob decided to use when he first met up with George Knapp and did that interview in May of 1989. And he was going to meet up with Dennis at a casino, Union Plaza Casino, I think, in Vegas. And Dennis wanted to meet him there, and he comes up to Dennis at like a blackjack table, and Dennis won't even look him in the eyes. And then he comes back to his house, and his house has been broken into. And I think Luigi asked him, was anything taken? And Bob says, yes, something was. But he doesn't go any further than that, which leads me to believe or suspect that they may have gotten the 115, the element 115. Although there is some actual, we saw some real pictures of, like, they're almost like hockey pucks that allegedly have the element 115 or some aspect of it on there. So I don't know. I would urge anybody who's ever heard of Bob Lazar or is interested in his story, or wants to learn more about it, or a different take on this super secret facility out in the side of a mountain called S4, by all means, go watch this movie. It is absolutely worth your time. No, there's no question. It is absolutely worth your time. Watch it. Make up your own mind. Like I said, if I was going to put a percentage on, the Bob Lazar story, how much do I believe? How much do I don't believe? I would say I'm 75-25. 75% of me believes Bob. The other 25%, maybe not. But it's absolutely worth your time to check out. Go watch S4. It is a very good documentary. One of the better ones that we've had. Done really well. It's gotten a lot of buzz. A lot of people have tuned in and checked that out. So let's move into the second documentary. And this is a little bit older. This is a few months earlier. But I got to see American Sasquatch. And for those of you who don't know what this is about, I'm actually going to play the trailer here for you, the trailer for American Sasquatch, so you can check it out for yourself and see what this movie was about. And then we'll talk about it, because this was a little bit easier to kind of digest. So let's get into it here. And yep, here we go.
I've been a woodsman all my life, and then I've never been afraid of anything that's in the woods. But I am just a little bit afraid of these Bigfoots. When you go up there, you're in their backyard.
They have been here for a long time.
Oh, there you go.
It's not simply some creature.
There's two divergent thoughts on what Bigfoot is. One side believes it's an ape, gorilla. The other school of thought is it's multidimensional. There's a physical and a non-physical aspect to it.
You've got Bigfoot, you've got orbs, and I mean, the two go hand in hand.
You'll have a Bigfoot sighting and then a UFO sighting, or vice versa.
There is high strangeness attached to almost every meaningful Bigfoot encounter.
We started tracking this creature the tracks disappear. They're gone.
Some people know some things that they don't want other people to know.
It's pretty surprising what we found. Skinwalker Ranch. Research on orbs, Bigfoot.
There were unusual creatures on Skinwalker Ranch.
There's a lot of information that doesn't get talked about. The paranormal things that no ape could certainly do.
If you're out to solve the problem, you're going to have to know all aspects of it.
I saw a Sasquatch and it vanished into thin air.
Through the night vision, seeing something completely different.
There's things out there we just don't see or understand.
Has the ability to cloak.
It rewrites history.
They were astonishing to see. Right here.
Oh, God.
So yeah, American Sasquatch, man, myth, monster. This is one that I know other people have talked about before, and this was an awesome documentary. This is, and I know, and it's so odd to me because when I was a kid and first started getting into this stuff, it was the cryptids that kind of brought me into this weird world quicker than anything else did. You know, it was the cryptids. It was Bigfoot. It was the Loch Ness Monster. It was the Abominable Snowman. It was that kind of stuff that got me into it. And, you know, I didn't really realize until recently how there's this seemingly hard dividing line between people who believe in UFOs and people who believe in cryptids. And it's kind of odd. It's like, I didn't know that. And this documentary does a really good job of bridging that gap and talking about and raising some aspects of Bigfoot that you don't normally think about. And the documentary is very good, like they said in the trailer, about discussing how there are two camps. There are two thoughts about what Bigfoot is. On the one hand, people think that Sasquatch, it's a biological creature. It's an ape like Gigantopithecus or a relative of that or something like that. It's a primate. It is purely biological. Then you've got the other camp that thinks that there's an interdimensional or transdimensional or some paranormal aspect of Bigfoot. And there's really compelling arguments made for both sides in this documentary. And a lot of people who, you know, when they get into this and they start, you know, studying Sasquatch and that sort of thing, they find themselves in one camp or the other, and they stay there. And they don't it doesn't cross over. They don't get into anything else. And you know, it's different. Like the cryptids and the UFO people who just don't generally coexist or commingle, that sort of thing. But with Bigfoot, it's like the people who think it's biological versus something else that dividing line's even more well defined, that sort of thing. But this was really an awesome documentary. And I know I listened to Andy McGrillen's review on this on his that UFO podcast a while ago. I'll give you my own thoughts on this. American Sasquatch, Man, Myth, or Monster. This came out at the end of 2025, directed by David Paulides, who, you know, does a lot of work with the Missing 411 series and that sort of thing. You know, there's a strong Native American connection in this documentary in a lot of places. You got it's looking at the cultural roots of Sasquatch, various tribal histories. A lot of people think that, you know, the Native Americans think that Sasquatch is another tribe or a different sort of tribe, that it's not just like, you know, that it's not just like a primate or something, but a different tribe of Native Americans altogether, like somebody, you know, breakaway civilization or something perhaps. But then, you know, you talk about, you know, the biological skepticism versus the evidence, you know, because a lot of the people on the biological side of things, they always get into the whole, well, if it was biological, where's the body? And that's true. And this is one of the big reasons why I have shifted. And I used to be firmly in the camp of it's a biological creature. It's an ape. It's something left over. It's a former primate, maybe the missing link, right? We always talk about the missing link between apes and man. What if it's that? Or what if he's our next evolution or Bigfoot? But, you know, there's like an overview in the video or in the documentary of past hair and soil samples. The problem is that all those samples get contaminated, or you get inconclusive results that they come back with a mix of human and unknown primate, and there's no real way to avoid these samples getting contaminated out in the open like that. You know, so that's one of the aspects of things, but you know, I'll just kind of break it down a little bit more for you guys and kind of go into the two different camps, because I think that is the key aspect, the key point of this documentary. The most important aspect of this is really defining this dividing line between, is Bigfoot biological, is he flesh and blood, or is he interdimensional? The high strangeness theory. So, you know, the traditional view of the biological flesh and blood, the old guard sort of aspect of things, is that it's an uncatalogued hominid, possibly, like I said, a relic population of Gigantopithecus, some other branch of the human family tree, like I talked about, the missing link aspect. You know, you've got a lot of this has very physical interactions, right? You got branches breaking, the horrid putrid smell that everybody associates when Sasquatch is near. You hear that a lot. These things throwing rocks at people, leaving distinct footprints with dermal ridges like fingerprints, nearly impossible to fake across thousands of sightings. You know, they talk a little bit about the Patterson-Gimlin film. There's a lot of really cool footage in here, and I forget, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the one guy who got some really compelling footage in this whole thing that when you look at it, you see like, wow, okay, that's some interesting stuff. That's some really good video. There's some really strange stuff as well. But, you know, they've got prints of like, it looks like people have put their knuckles, like these Sasquatches have put their knuckles in the ground, and you see the dents and the impressions of all that sort of thing. Of course, the goal in anybody who's in the biological camp is to find any sort of specimen, a body, some biological animal that eats, breathes, it dies like any other. These don't fit that narrative, which is why I start to shift firmly into the interdimensional high strangeness theory. And this is a lot of where David Paulides kind of his work kind of steers into this aspect of things. If there is a complaint that a lot of people have for this, is that there's too much of this woo sort of factor, and that's okay. But I think when you're talking about a subject like Bigfoot, you've almost got to embrace this woo. It's not a traditional animal. Sasquatch could very well be a transdimensional being. It can slip in and out of our physical spectrum. There's aspects of the video of the documentary that seem to show creatures cloaking or disappearing mid-stride. There's one where there's like a security camera looking at, I think it's like a playground, like one of those merry-go-rounds. And you see this black figure come out of the ground, and it's like barely there for a second, and then it vanishes. You know, we've got the lack of any sort of remains, decades of searching. This is the thing that always gets to me, is like all these sightings, but there's never any body. There's never any remnants of any of this stuff, which tells me that they are not in our dimension, that they're coming in and out of our dimension. There's the portals. Some experts in the film suggest sightings are often tied to specific energy vortexes or portals. Dr. Colm Kelleher, you know, a lot of us know Dr. Colm Kelleher from Skinwalkers at the Pentagon with Jim Lukatsky and George Knapp. He has a pretty 15 minutes of speaking in this. He talks a lot about stuff going on out at Skinwalker Ranch and some of the creatures that have been seen out at Skinwalker Ranch, portals that have been seen out there that are only visible in night vision. Like in night vision, they see these things that aren't normally there otherwise. There's some really cool sort of just descriptions of things that are going on out at Skinwalker Ranch that he was so involved with. But it really digs down into this stuff. And the more, you know, one of the guys in the video is talking about how virtually every Bigfoot encounter has some element of high strangeness to it. There's something strange about it. Somebody else is talking about how there's, like in the trailer, there's always UFOs associated with these sightings. When these sightings come in, there's almost always UFOs involved as well. And that really starts lending towards the side of the fence that says there's something more involved here with Bigfoot than just, you know, something biological. You know, but like I said, these two groups, they rarely agree on this stuff. The biological crowd feels the interdimensional theory makes the subject look like a joke and ruins scientific credibility. Okay. The interdimensional crowd, they're going to argue the only reason we haven't caught one in 100 years of searching is that they aren't just biological animals. And to me, I think, it is, and I keep finding, like I said, I started off being firmly in the biological crowd and that sort of thing. And as the years have gone on, I don't think so anymore. I think it's an interdimensional being. There's one guy, he talks about this really frightening event that takes place where he wasn't even looking for like an encounter or a sighting. And these beings came out of like a portal, and they were smaller than any sort of Bigfoot and ferocious looking. And they were coming right at him, and he shined a flashlight on him, and they just vanished, stuff like that, but there's a lot of stuff with the orbs, witnesses frequently reporting seeing large orbs in the exact same location as a Sasquatch sighting, often appearing just before or after the creature vanishes. There's like a lot of people describing sudden and total silence where all the forest, everything in the forest, crickets, birds, everything stops instantly. And is it the animals being quiet because of a predator, or did a witness enter a bubble? One of the witnesses talks about how she was hiking and she walked around these trees and everything shifted, and like her viewpoint and everything shifted into this strange sort of like portal-like experience. And she was talking to somebody, and this person knew exactly where she was in the forest because, like, yeah, we know all about this sort of thing. If these things are able to cloak and do things like predator, that's not biological. That is something else. That is something where you're looking at that saying, okay, that is completely something different. That is a interdimensional sort of aspect of sort of things. A lot of people don't think that, even the people who, are in this interdimensional camp and that sort of thing and leaning onto that side of things, they don't think that Sasquatch is an alien. Maybe it's a guardian or, some other being that's here to kind of watch over us. This is why a lot of people think they're seen in these portal window areas like Skinwalker Ranch where UAP activity is high. Are they like a biological UAP, like a more advanced, we talk about the grays and how a lot of people, myself included, think they're synthetic AI, but in reality, are these a different form of NHI, that sort of thing? It's very interesting, and it's an excellent documentary. It's the second really good one that I've seen. So I would say, if you're remotely interested in Sasquatch, if Bigfoot interests you in any way, then by all means go and watch this documentary. It is equally worth your time. So, I mean, those are two that are just really, really excellent, excellent movies, excellent documentaries that I would certainly say go and check those out. They are absolutely worth your time, and I cannot recommend them enough. So hold on a second here. So sorry about that. The other thing I wanted to do is we got, so those, like I said, two really good documentaries that I've seen, and both of them are absolutely worth your time, especially American Sasquatch. If you are even remotely interested in Bigfoot and a different perspective on Sasquatch, that is worth your time to check out and just kind of think about it differently. I want to play for you next is we've got a trailer that I think I'd mentioned on the outset. It's a movie coming up that seems to be a documentary of sorts about Jeremy Corbell. It's called Sleeping Dog. I think this one's coming out on May the 12th, if I remember correctly, that sort of thing. So I'm going to play this trailer for you guys, and we will be right back. But I do think like this, I know they're going to show a screening of this at Contact in the Desert, but I'm going to play this trailer for Sleeping Dog for you, and we'll talk about it. Here, let's see. Come on. Where are you? There you are. Hold on a sec. Okay, here we go.
Your journalistic credentials mean jack shit. If you look in the 70s and 80s with the CIA, they used to have reporters on their payroll. They don't respect anybody.
Corbell is an investigative journalist who helped obtain and release the DoD footage of UFOs.
I've been holding a secret for about 11 years, and it's going to be extremely public. It's not a video of an alien. It's not a video of one craft. It's more than that. Years ago, I went searching for the truth about UFOs, and I found it.
He was the most curious kid ever.
The first person that I pointed a camera at was John Lear.
John Lear, son of the famed aviation pioneer, the world-class pilot.
The government has between 30 and 50 alien bodies.
Cold called his phone, and he picked up. I want to bring, a camera, and then how open he was with me.
This was not part of my game plan at all.
Flying saucers, flying discs of extraterrestrial origin.
The evidence is very strong. They've been here and are here.
It's an Alice in Wonderland planet. Very few people will ever find the truth, but everybody is looking for the truth, and a lot of people think that they found the truth, but that's impossible.
I'm like the least qualified person on planet Earth. One thing I am is I am worthy of your trust.
If you really have stuff that is that sensitive that you cannot release, you're relying on your connection as a journalist. They're not going to come after you, not only you, they're going to come after your family. If I die, this story comes out.
It would represent one of the largest leaks in American history. I don't know what to do, man. Is it worth it? To who?
I guess it helps to unmute myself before I start talking. But anyway, there you go. Sleeping Dog coming out on May 12th, 2026. Looks really interesting. Looks like a very interesting movie with Jeremy Corbell and kind of how he got into this whole thing that he's doing. Him and George have done a lot of the work, a lot of the heavy lifting as far as getting a lot of this UAP information and these videos and these sort of things and leaks and that sort of thing, that, or if you can call them leaks. And so, you get to see some of Jeremy's background as far as, I think he's in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or he's a black belt and that sort of thing. But one thing I know, it's like there's at one point in the video or the trailer, that is clearly Dylan Borland's voice on that phone call where the guy says, if I die, this all comes out. And that was very interesting to see that whole thing.